I knew my time at Novacore Systems was coming to an end long before the words were spoken out loud, long before my name disappeared from documents, long before the polite smiles turned cold, and long before Elaine Parker stood on that stage pretending she was building the future while quietly erasing the past. Because the truth is, this story didn't begin with my firing. It began the moment a company forgot who built its spine. I am Daniel Reeves, 55 years old, an engineer by instinct and by obsession, the kind of man who believes systems should work even when people don't. And for almost 17 years, Novacore had been my second home, a place where I poured nights, weekends, and fragments of my life into a biometric security platform so advanced that investors didn't even fully understand it. They just knew it was valuable. Valuable enough to give Novacore its entire valuation, its reputation, its seat at billion-dollar tables. And yet when Elaine Parker arrived, everything shifted. Because Elaine didn't see experience as wisdom, she saw it as resistance. She walked in wearing confidence tailored by consultants, speaking in phrases polished by investor decks, smiling the way people smile when they've already decided who they're going to replace. And within weeks of her arrival, meetings I once led were reassigned, decisions I once signed off on were rerouted, and my role was quietly rebranded from architect to legacy contributor, a phrase that sounds respectful until you realize it means disposable. I watched my authority dissolve not with confrontation, but with silence, with calendar invites that stopped coming, with documents where my name had once lived, now listing vague teams instead of a single accountable mind. And every instinct I had told me to speak up, to push back, to remind them that this system, the one guarding government facilities, financial institutions, and critical infrastructure, wasn't something you could treat like a slide in a pitch deck. But I didn't. I waited, because systems teach patience, and patience teaches timing. The final moment came during an all-hands meeting, the kind designed to look transparent while hiding shark decisions behind applause, when Elaine stood under bright lights and talked about necessary evolution, about aligning talent with growth, and then said my name like it was already history, announcing my termination in front of hundreds of people as if it were a routine adjustment, her voice calm, rehearsed, confident, while my career was reduced to a sentence ending with the phrase, necessary for growth. And in that moment, something inside the room shifted, because people avoided my eyes, some out of fear, some out of guilt, and some because they already understood what Elaine did not, that you don't casually discard the man who knows where every hidden lever is buried. I didn't argue, I didn't interrupt, I didn't ask for a private conversation. I simply nodded, packed my things, and walked out past glass walls that reflected a man who looked calm but felt sharpened. Because anger burns fast, but clarity burns slow and steady. While Elaine rushed forward chasing headlines and a $550 million acquisition that would cement her reputation as the CEO who took Novacore to the next level, I returned home to a quiet office filled with old notebooks, original schematics, and memories of decisions made long before she ever learned the company's name. And that's where the real story began to unfold. Because what Elaine never bothered to understand, what no one in her inner circle bothered to read carefully, was the foundation of Novacore's most valuable asset, the biometric engine everyone called proprietary, the technology investors believed the company fully owned, the engine they were about to sell like a car they assumed was theirs. But ownership is a precise word, and precision is where engineers live. Years earlier, when Novacore was still fragile and desperate, when funding was uncertain and promises were easy to break, I had protected my life's work the only way I knew how, legally, quietly, without drama, by licensing the technology instead of surrendering it, a decision that had once been praised as temporary, then forgotten as success piled up. And buried deep inside that licensing agreement was a clause so clean, so unambiguous, that it didn't threaten or warn, it simply waited.
a clause that stated any false ownership claim in official filings would trigger immediate termination of rights, no negotiations, no grace period, no second chances. And as news of the acquisition spread, as Elaine's team celebrated, as documents were prepared and submitted declaring Novacor the full and rightful owner of the biometric system, I read those filings from my quiet office, my hands steady, my breathing slow, because revenge doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives with signatures. I made one phone call, not to Elaine, not to the board, but to my attorney. A man who doesn't raise his voice and doesn't miss details. And when I told him to activate the clause, there was a pause on the line. Then a simple response, understood. And in that moment, everything Elaine believed she controlled began to slip away, even though she didn't feel it yet. Not until the clock started ticking, not until the engine she thought she owned quietly, legally, and irreversibly shut its doors. And as I sat back in my chair, listening to the hum of a system I had built from nothing, I realized something important. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs.
The morning after the filings were activated, the office that once buzzed with confidence now hummed with confusion. Whispers slipped through glass walls like a quiet storm. Elaine Parker arrived at work expecting celebration, a champagne moment, or at least pats on the back from her team. Instead, she was greeted by a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like a warning. The legal department had begun sending urgent emails, flagged in red, and urgent enough to make even the most composed managers break a sweat. Her face tightened, a mask of disbelief that the world she thought she controlled was slipping through her fingers, and it all started with a single clause she had never bothered to read. Investors called, board members called, internal managers called. Every conversation began with, "We have a problem," and ended with silence because nobody could find a solution fast enough. Elaine's voice, which had always sounded decisive, now trembled slightly when she asked for answers. How could this be? Novacor had the technology. The contract said they owned it. And yet, one after another, legal counters, certified letters, and official notifications proved that everything she had assumed, everything she had announced in meetings and press releases, was wrong. Within hours, the $550 million acquisition, once considered a done deal, was collapsing. Investors demanded explanations, walked away from term sheets, and for the first time, Elaine realized that confidence alone does not create value. Inside the boardroom, chaos erupted. Chairs scraped across polished floors. Phones rang incessantly. Senior executives, some loyal to Elaine and some quietly aligned with the realities of engineering and ownership, argued over next steps. Elaine tried to assert control, but control had a new meaning now, one she hadn't experienced before. Every demand she made was met with caution or outright refusal. Emails were forwarded directly to my attorney, the man who had activated the clause, the one person Elaine had never imagined would enter the equation. I didn't call. I didn't send a single email. I wasn't even in the office. Yet every motion Elaine tried to make, every decision she tried to force, landed against an immovable wall of legality and prepared documentation. Meanwhile, I watched from a distance, a silent observer. Revenge, I had learned long ago, works best when it's slow, deliberate, almost invisible until it hits full effect. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply watched. And as the day unfolded, I noticed the tiny cracks appearing in the facade Elaine had spent weeks building. Her assistants, usually impeccably loyal, now glanced nervously at her, unsure if she could protect their own positions. Board members who had once nodded at her every word now questioned her judgment openly. Investors, previously dazzled by her charisma, now demanded proof, evidence, and legal clarity that she couldn't provide. All of it was the result of one simple fact. She had gambled with someone else's life's work, assuming the engine ran only because she had the ignition key. By late afternoon, the internal emails had escalated into emergency meetings. Elaine was summoned to private discussions with the board. I knew what they were telling her before she did. Her credibility, her position, her career trajectory within Novacor,
Everything was hanging by a thread. And yet, even as the walls closed in, she still didn't grasp the scope of the situation. Ownership is not about appearances. Ownership is about documented and forcible reality. She had assumed the company's power extended beyond the agreements I had written years ago. She had assumed that no one would question it, and she had assumed she could replace experience with charisma. And then came the calls. Board members, one by one, began reaching out to me, not as a former employee, not as someone wronged, but as the single individual holding the lever that could either stabilize or destroy the company. Their tone was entirely different now. Polished, professional voices trembled with urgency and desperation. "Daniel, can we talk?" they asked. The words were careful, respectful, almost pleading. In those moments, I realized something profound. Power is not taken by force. Power is recognized when leverage exists. And in that room, I held all of it. Elaine didn't know it yet, but her downfall was imminent, not because of malice, not because I wanted revenge in the traditional sense, but because systems, contracts, and preparation always win over arrogance and impulse. I had spent years ensuring the technology could not be misappropriated, and now the safeguards I installed, quietly, legally, irreversibly, were paying dividends. The chaos was beautiful in its inevitability. People who had dismissed me, ignored me, and labeled me resistant to change were now realizing that I had been the one controlling the very foundation of their future. As the sun began to set, Elaine sat in her office, blinds half drawn, staring at documents that made her pulse quicken. Emergency meetings had already stripped her of many temporary powers. Legal teams had issued memos that halted all external communications about the acquisition. Investors had frozen discussions. And while she plotted how to survive the day, my phone rang. Not her, not a single voice from the chaos, but from the board members themselves. The tone was clear. They wanted me back. Not as a subordinate, not as an employee, but as the architect of what they now understood could not exist without me. In that moment, I smiled, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The storm I had set in motion was no longer abstract. It was real. The collapse of Elaine Parker's acquisition dream, the panic in the boardroom, the silent acknowledgement of my authority, all of it was the result of careful patience, legal foresight, and the slow burn of a man who understood the true value of what he had built. And yet, even as I prepared to respond to the board's calls, I knew this wasn't about revenge in its simplest form. It was about balance, justice, and the kind of power that comes not from firing people, but from knowing exactly who holds the keys before anyone else tries to drive the car.
The next morning, the office atmosphere was thick with tension, a quiet storm swirling beneath the surface. Elaine Parker arrived, expecting her usual aura of control, expecting congratulations or at least nods of approval from her team. Instead, she found silence, an almost tangible warning. Emails flagged as urgent flooded inboxes, legal memos piled up on desks, and every department seemed to be holding its breath. Elaine's confident demeanor faltered ever so slightly. Disbelief flickered in her eyes. She had assumed victory, assumed ownership, assumed that charisma and bold claims could substitute for careful legal groundwork. But assumptions have a way of crashing into reality, and today, hers were colliding at full force. Investors called first, their voices calm but urgent, demanding answers that Elaine could not provide. Board members followed, insisting on immediate explanations, their tone increasingly impatient and wary. Internal managers, who once nodded at every directive she gave, now questioned, hesitated, and circled back with doubts she hadn't expected. Every conversation, every email, every phone call began with a version of the same terrifying phrase, "We have a problem." And the problem wasn't just the failed acquisition. It was that every official filing, every proud claim about Novacore's complete ownership of the technology had just been legally invalidated. Her announcement to the world that Novacore fully owned the engine she had been trying to sell? False. A misstep with consequences so immediate that chaos erupted before she could even comprehend it.
Inside the boardroom, panic was palpable. Chairs scraped across polished floors as senior executives argued heatedly over damage control. Phones rang incessantly. The company's leadership, previously aligned behind Elaine, began to fracture. Every attempt she made to assert authority was met with caution, resistance, or silence. And all the while, every document, every contract, every memo that could potentially save the day was already in my attorney's hands, the one person Elaine had never considered in her calculations. I was invisible, but my presence was everywhere, like the air in the room, essential but unnoticed until it became scarce. I watched quietly from my distant vantage point, deliberately absent from the chaos. Revenge is rarely immediate. It is a patient, deliberate process. Gloating too soon often destroys the effect. A slow burn, calculated and precise, carries more weight. As I observed, cracks began to form in Elaine's carefully constructed facade. Assistants, once unwaveringly loyal, now looked at her with hesitation. Board members, who had previously nodded at every word she gave, began to question her judgment. Investors, dazzled by her charm and promises, now demanded proof, documentation, anything to assure them that their billions were safe. And all of this, quietly, legally, irreversibly, was the product of one fact. She had dared to gamble with someone else's life's work. By mid-afternoon, the pressure escalated further. Emergency meetings were convened. Legal teams issued memos halting communications about the acquisition. Emails flew faster than anyone could read them, all pointing toward one central truth. Novacor did not, in fact, legally own the technology. The very foundation of Elaine's authority, her public image, and the multi-million-dollar acquisition was crumbling. The panic was both exquisite and inevitable. She had assumed power could be taken by audacity and charm, but power built on assumption evaporates when confronted with the truth. And then came the calls I had been waiting for. Calls not from Elaine, not from her desperate inner circle, but from the board members themselves. One by one, their tones shifted completely. Gone were the casual directives, replaced with careful, almost pleading respect. "Daniel, we need to talk," they said, their voices carrying urgency and acknowledgement. For the first time, I realized that true power is recognized only when leverage is clear, and in this situation, I held all of it. Every decision, every plan, every hope for a smooth acquisition was dependent on me, the man she had dismissed. Elaine remained blind to the scope of her predicament. In her office, blinds half drawn, she stared at documents that seemed incomprehensible. Emergency meetings had stripped her of temporary powers. The legal memos had frozen all external communications. Investors were pulling back. And while she tried to regain control, she still did not understand the magnitude of what she had underestimated. Ownership is not an illusion. It is not an opinion. It is enforceable reality, and she had assumed otherwise. She had assumed no one would notice the discrepancy. She had assumed experience could be replaced by ego. By evening, the calls from the board had multiplied, each more insistent than the last. They were no longer negotiating, they were begging, careful in their words, precise in their tone. They offered terms, accommodations, privileges, everything they had once reserved for Elaine. And all of it hinged on one factor: my willingness to act, my recognition of my own leverage, my understanding of the system I had built. I listened quietly, letting them reveal their desperation, letting them recognize what they had ignored for so long. I was not merely an employee, I was the foundation. The engine ran because I had built it, and no smooth talk or executive swagger could change that. As the sun began to set, Elaine remained oblivious, still plotting how to reclaim control, still hoping for a miracle. And I realized a fundamental truth. Revenge is not about impulsive retaliation. It is about patience, precision, and the ability to act when the moment is undeniably yours. And tonight, the moment had arrived. The chaos, the panic, the collapse of authority. It was all a consequence of preparation, foresight, and the slow, inevitable burn of a system designed to protect what is yours. Power is not taken by firing someone. Power is recognized when you know exactly who holds the keys, and only then do you move.
The next morning, the tension had become almost tangible in every corner of Novacor's offices. Even the usually unshakable senior executives moved like cautious animals, carefully choosing each word, each gesture, as if the ground beneath them had suddenly turned to ice. Elaine Parker arrived with her usual polished confidence, but it was already cracked. Her carefully rehearsed smile faltered as she opened her office door and found muted conversations, hurried glances, and an undercurrent of fear that no management book could teach her to control. Emails piled up like red flags. Phone calls went unanswered because no one wanted to deliver the devastating news she had yet to fully understand, and a sense of urgency gripped every corner of the building. For the first time, Elaine experienced what it meant to be powerless while being watched. Each board member, each investor, each department head now regarded her with a careful, almost clinical skepticism. No one argued on her behalf. Her usual persuasive charm, which had earned her nods and smiles, had little effect on a reality she could not manipulate. Each legal memo, each notice, each carefully documented fact about ownership of the biometric system reinforced one simple truth. The company did not and never had the legal authority to sell the technology, modify it, or claim it as its own. Everything she had assumed she controlled was slipping through her fingers in a legal, irrevocable way. The board convened emergency meetings, pulling her aside, questioning her decisions, asking her to justify actions that, in hindsight, were reckless. They reminded her, almost painfully, that she had ignored the one clause that mattered, the licensing agreement that made the technology mine, not Novacor's. Each reminder chipped away at her confidence, eroded the control she had assumed she possessed. And through it all, she still didn't know that I was waiting, watching, and allowing the system I had designed to operate exactly as intended. From my quiet vantage point, the chaos unfolding below was the culmination of years of preparation. I didn't need to confront her. I didn't need to storm into the office or demand apologies. The systems were already in motion, built to protect my work, my reputation, and my leverage. Every error she made, every misstep born from overconfidence, every public claim she filed incorrectly triggered exactly the chain of events I had quietly anticipated. And the best part? I wasn't there physically. I was an invisible force, a shadow whose presence only became tangible when it was far too late to undo the consequences. The phone calls started, not from Elaine, not from her desperate aides, from board members, legal teams, and investors, each seeking clarity, each seeking guidance, and each acknowledging, silently and sometimes out loud, that I was the only person who could restore stability. "Daniel, can we meet?" one board member asked, carefully, cautiously. "We need your expertise, urgently." Another followed. "We've underestimated the situation. Your involvement is now critical." It wasn't a request. It was an acknowledgement of leverage, a recognition of authority, a subtle apology for mistakes made too confidently. Elaine was now a spectator to her own undoing. She paced her office, blinds drawn, papers scattered, frantic yet unable to stop the legal and operational dominoes from falling. Emails flagged urgent were addressed to me. Emails she had written were returned with formal legal responses. Investor calls were rerouted to my attorney. Her ego, which previously filled every room with confidence, now shrank in the face of reality. And still she clung to a hope that there might be some way to salvage her position, some miracle she could conjure with words, charisma, or pressure. But the reality was simple. The rules were set, the systems were prepared, and she had no power over either.
By late afternoon, the board officially contacted me. They were no longer polite, no longer neutral. They were cautious, respectful, almost pleading. They wanted my presence, my advice, my authority, not as an employee, not as someone they had wronged, but as the architect of the system they now understood they could not control without me. And in that realization, a powerful truth crystallized. Power is not the loud announcement of authority. Power is leverage recognized at the precise moment it matters most. And in this room, in this moment, I held all the leverage. Even as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elaine's office remained a scene of quiet panic. She calculated, plotted, and hoped, but the momentum was no longer hers to command. I had become the silent arbiter of what would happen next, the one who could determine whether Novacor stumbled or survived. Revenge had never been about vindictiveness. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that those who gambled recklessly with someone else's work understood the consequences. And in this instance, the consequences were unavoidable, irreversible, and about to become profoundly clear. The storm, measured, precise, inevitable, was no longer theoretical. It had arrived, and it would continue with each board meeting, each phone call, each email, reminding everyone who truly held the keys.
By the next morning, Novacor was a company in controlled chaos. Departments that once functioned like clockwork were now scrambling to adjust to the reality that the technology they believed they owned was in fact outside their control. Elaine Parker walked the halls with a tension that was almost palpable, a stark contrast to the confident CEO who had once entered those same doors radiating assurance. The energy of the office had shifted. Where there had once been whispered admiration for her decisiveness, there were now murmurs of doubt, apprehension, and even quiet resentment. People avoided her gaze, knowing that the board's confidence had shifted away from her and towards someone who had quietly built the engine powering the company. The first calls from the board came early. They weren't demanding or bureaucratic. They were measured, deliberate, almost apologetic in tone. "Daniel, we need to discuss next steps," said one, carefully choosing words as though even speaking recklessly could worsen the situation. Another followed. "Your involvement is critical now, more than ever. We underestimated the importance of the systems and the clauses you set in place." Each call reminded me, subtly, that power is not about authority granted. It is about leverage recognized. Every conversation confirmed the growing realization among those who had once dismissed me. I wasn't simply an employee. I was the man who could determine whether Novacor could continue at all. Meanwhile, Elaine's desperation began to manifest in small, almost imperceptible ways. Her emails became frantic, often marked urgent, yet addressed to departments that were already legally restrained from taking action. Her assistants moved carefully around her, speaking less and hesitating more. Meetings that once followed her agenda were now dictated by board members who sought guidance from me rather than her. And yet, she clung to hope that her charm, her supposed strategic genius, could reverse the tide. But charm has limits. Legal reality has none. The board convened another emergency meeting, this time to directly address the impending collapse of the acquisition deal. Investors had frozen negotiations, waiting for clarity that only I could provide. Elaine tried to assert control, tried to convince the board that the situation could be corrected with internal maneuvers and revised filings, but every suggestion she made was met with hesitation, questions, and redirection. The board had come to a realization that Elaine would never admit aloud. She had no legal authority over the technology, and without my consent, nothing could move forward. Her confidence, once intimidating, had transformed into visible panic. I remained calm, quiet, deliberate. From my vantage point, I didn't need to intervene yet. The chain of consequences I had initiated continued to unfold with precision.
Each misstep she had made, each false assumption, each overconfident declaration had compounded to create a perfect storm of urgency and accountability. It was almost artful in its inevitability. The chaos, while destructive, was merely the natural outcome of neglecting the rules, of ignoring the one person who had built the very system the company relied upon. When the board finally reached out to me for a private discussion, the tone of their calls made one thing perfectly clear. They weren't asking for my help. They were acknowledging my authority. "Daniel, we need you back. The company cannot function without your guidance," said one member, almost reverently. Another added, "You hold the key to stabilizing Novacor. We were wrong to ignore your position, and we want to make this right." This was no longer negotiation. This was recognition. Recognition that true power does not come from titles, charisma, or even firing someone. True power comes from holding what no one else can take without consent. Elaine, meanwhile, was beginning to see the inevitable. She spent hours poring over the very clauses she had ignored, realizing the gravity of her mistakes. Every legal line, every carefully constructed condition now illuminated a reality she could not escape. The acquisition she had championed, the growth she had promised investors, all hinged on a single individual she had once discarded. Panic gave way to frustration, frustration to quiet dread, as she slowly comprehended that her downfall wasn't caused by malevolence or sabotage. It was caused by her own arrogance and ignorance. By the evening, the situation had crystallized. The acquisition deal was dead unless I chose to intervene. The board sought me out directly. Elaine, isolated and powerless, could only watch as her plans unraveled before her eyes. And as I prepared to respond to the board's calls, I understood the fundamental lesson embedded in every interaction, every misstep, every panic-stricken meeting. Systems, preparation, and knowledge cannot be overridden by ego. True power waits patiently, silently, until those who underestimate it are forced to acknowledge its presence. And so the stage was set. The board's desperation, the investors' hesitation, and Elaine's growing panic were all aligned perfectly. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and when it came, it would demonstrate not only the cost of arrogance, but the enduring strength of careful, calculated leverage. I had the engine, I had the legal power, I had the patience. And the world of Novacor, for better or worse, was about to learn that some mistakes cannot be ignored and some people cannot be underestimated.
The following morning, Novacor was no longer just a company in chaos. It had become a theater of reckoning. The walls that once reverberated with confident directives now echoed with tension, uncertainty, and the faint but unmistakable hum of a system governed by someone who had quietly built it. Elaine Parker arrived early, her polished demeanor weakened, her stride hesitant. She had rehearsed conversations, prepared defensive documents, and even strategized speeches to regain credibility. Yet, as she entered the boardroom, the subtle shifts were unmistakable. The board members' eyes no longer sought approval from her, they sought clarity, guidance, and authorization from the one person they had previously dismissed. From the moment she opened the room, the balance of power had already shifted irrevocably. I walked into the room with calm precision, fully aware of the effect my presence had. Chairs shifted slightly. Voices dropped an octave, and the subtle nods of acknowledgement made clear that the board now recognized a fundamental truth. The engine of Novacor ran because I had built it, and no amount of executive charisma could replace that reality. Elaine's confident gaze faltered, revealing the first real crack in the facade she had maintained for weeks. In that moment, the game that had been quietly set in motion, the slow, deliberate orchestration of leverage, patience, and legal precision was ready to conclude. The board began with cautious explanations, carefully worded apologies, and an acknowledgement of their misjudgment. They did not speak to me as a subordinate. They spoke as individuals who had come to terms with their error and now sought to make amends. "Daniel, we underestimated the situation.
one of them admitted. Your guidance is essential. We want to restore balance and ensure the company survives this crisis, another added. We cannot proceed without your authority and oversight. We were wrong to ignore your position, and we want to correct that. Every word reinforced what I had known all along. Real power is recognized only when leverage is undeniable. Elaine sat silently, absorbing the reality she had long avoided. The acquisitions, the investments, the public declarations, everything hinged on my consent, my authority, my willingness to act. Panic, frustration, and finally resignation crossed her features. She had overestimated her control, underestimated my position, and now faced the consequence of her arrogance. The irony was sharp. She had fired me believing she could redefine ownership, accelerate growth, and impress investors. Yet in doing so, she had catalyzed the very downfall she sought to prevent. I listened to the board carefully, weighing my response. Revenge, I knew, is most potent when it is deliberate, measured, and principled. I did not need to humiliate Elaine publicly. The system, the contracts, and the consequences had done that silently and thoroughly. My conditions were clear. The technology must be placed entirely under my control. All decisions must be made with engineering reality at the forefront rather than ego, and no one like Elaine, someone who gambled recklessly with another person's life's work, could be allowed to hold similar power in the future. The board, aware of the stakes, agreed immediately. They had no alternative. The lesson had been delivered with devastating clarity. The settlement was finalized quickly, with terms far beyond what Elaine could have imagined. Greater control, higher compensation, full authority over the technology, every aspect of Novacore's core asset was now firmly within my jurisdiction. Elaine, meanwhile, was quietly removed from the CEO position, replaced with leadership that understood the balance of responsibility, expertise, and authority. She was left to reflect on the consequences of her misjudgments, a powerful reminder that arrogance and impatience are often the fastest path to downfall. As I walked through the offices, observing the renewed sense of focus and clarity, I understood something profound. Power is not measured by titles, by public image, or by temporary control. True power comes from knowing who actually holds the keys before anyone else tries to drive the car. Novacore had learned the hard way that firing someone who understands the system, who built the foundation, can cost hundreds of millions of dollars, destroy deals, and unravel carefully constructed plans. In the end, the lesson was undeniable and the outcome unmistakable. I had not acted out of malice or desire to harm. I had acted to restore balance, enforce contracts, and protect what was rightfully mine. The chaos, the investor panic, the boardroom turmoil, they had been consequences of Elaine's mistakes. But the resolution was deliberate, controlled, and fair. Novacore emerged stabilized, stronger, and more aware of the real engines behind its success. And as for Elaine Parker, the lesson she learned was one she would carry for the rest of her career. Never underestimate experience, never ignore the foundation, and never gamble with someone else's life's work. In the quiet aftermath, I understood that patience, precision, and leverage are more powerful than any title, any speech, or any boardroom maneuver. True authority is recognized when preparation meets opportunity, when understanding outweighs ego, and when control is exercised not through fear but through undeniable knowledge. Novacore's future was secure, not because of intimidation, not because of risk-taking, but because the person who truly owned the engine was finally in charge.